Hey guys, so these are some preliminary thoughts that came to mind as I was reading through Oscar Wilde's The Soul of Man Under Socialism and John Dewey's Individualism, Old and New. A couple things immediately came to mind, namely the sources of individualism, the idea of individualism having a source. And I'm just going to give a fly by the seat of the pants view of what I've seen in European individualism. If you think all the way back to the earliest thing we can think of, i.e., ancient Rome, the nobility are seen as the only true individuals from a certain perspective. Uh, you fast forward a bit, or I guess you go back even further, the Roman Republic, the citizenry are the only true individuals. Not that they would have necessarily used the word individual back then. That's what's so interesting. I was doing some reading about this term individual, and it looks like it didn't come about until France in the 19th century. That's the earliest usage of it that I think I've seen. There might be something before then, but that's what I saw. So you go forward into European history, and I'm really glossing over things here, but the theological emphasis in much of Christendom, and some would argue in the Israel, the religious inclinations of Israel, was that the nation could be atoned for in a collective group. I mean, there's definitely people making sin offerings individually, going to confession individually in the Catholic era, the era that was dominated by Catholicism. But there's also the sense that you see this collective salvific experience granted to an army, maybe before a priest prays with them before battle. You see that in the Israelite view of the priest atoning for the people and their sins of the year. I believe that would happen once a year. But then I think we would all agree there's a shift during the Reformation. And that shift is that no longer does the laity have to rely on the priesthood to dictate to them what the words of God are. You have higher literacy levels coming into being out of the Renaissance. Movable type is invented. And gradually things begin to change. You have people like Martin Luther who are troubled by the Catholic Church. And when people like that from within, over a course of many years, began having problems with this, it looks to me that that would begin to build more of an individualism, in that the person is now focusing on whether or not they can gain salvation through an individual relationship with God, a personal relationship with God. So that's a shift that I see during the Reformation. I also see a shift during the Enlightenment, to a more of an emphasis on the reason of mankind. And a lot of people would say that the French Revolution was sort of a result of the Enlightenment. I don't know if I would agree with that, but those are things I've heard people say. And it's interesting because in the French Revolution you have different arguments between Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke, these two British thinkers. And Edmund Burke is really not behind the overthrow of the royalty individual. And Thomas Paine thinks it's common sense that the common individual should be elevated. But similar between all of these is individualism finding its anchor in something. You might say the Enlightenment found its anchor in reason. You might say that the era of deep religious feeling in Europe found its anchor in religion. You might say that the era of nationalism in Europe found its anchor in the state. What makes me a unique individual? Well, I'm a German, a part of a state, or I'm an Italian, a part of a state. And then there's also that underlying thing that existed for a very long time of the only true individuals some would claim would be those of an aristocratic bloodline. The only people who can claim that individualism. And these are all just things that I've gleaned from the writings of Dewey and Oscar Wilde. A problem you might already be seeing is I've given you all of these fly by the seat of your pants thoughts, but nobody has defined individualism, and that's a problem I've seen. We'll come back to that later. So Oscar Wilde in The Soul of Man Under Socialism, quote, "Over the gate to antiquity was the maxim, know thyself. Over the next gate shall stand, be thyself." And the next gate just simply means the gate of the modern or postmodern era. And that's just kind of hilarious. I laughed out loud when I read that in the book. I couldn't believe that he said that, because it just seems so trite today in our modern world, probably. I say, just be yourself, man. I mean, it's hilarious. But it's Oscar Wilde, this amazing author, writing this. It's something that I gathered from Oscar Wilde's in The Soul of Man was that his individualism seemed to be grounded back in upon the individual. So there's not this grounding outside the individual in reason or anything like that. And I thought that was against the grain from most of European thought philosophically. So that's something worth noting. He uses the person of Christ to illustrate this idea of knowing thyself versus being thyself. And he argues that Christ apparently preached the great gospel of being oneself. And that was just very entertaining to me. Probably shouldn't be, but it just was. Call that an alternative reading of the Gospels. But anyway, we'll go ahead and shift from European individualism to American individualism. And this might be a false dichotomy, I know, but I think it is at the very least a helpful dichotomy. So don't make the dichotomy the end-all and be-all of your system, but it's helpful for thinking through it. So the sources of American individualism, this is all based upon what I've heard people say they believe American individualism is grounded in. Some say it's grounded in rebellion, and they draw parallels between the French and American revolutions. Some say it's grounded in spiritual endowment of a deity, as seen in the preamble of the Constitution. Some say it's grounded in the concept of equal opportunity. So you're only an individual as much as you have the same opportunity as everybody else. And Dewey is the guy who gave me this idea that the individualism that he thinks is not good is grounded in pecuniary means. So the people who are individuals are only the people who can find the freedom that the accumulation of wealth gives them. And then there's people who believe in all or none of these. But what's interesting about this is all of these, I guess the one that's peculiarly American is the pecuniary means, or the equal opportunity. But it's tough to define equal opportunity. That's something that came to mind. How in the world do you even measure that? How do you quantify whether or not somebody has equal opportunity? So a thought that came to mind is that even a great grounding stone or foundation for an American idea of individualism. And then pecuniary means, at least that's measurable. At least you can say, okay, I've accumulated wealth, I have freedom, I'm a true individual. But yet again, the way I'm repeating this idea of being an individual, being a true individual, a free individual, what does it even mean? It just seems like a statement that doesn't mean anything, but gets thrown around a lot. In Dewey's time period, I did some research. Apparently Herbert Hoover was president for a good portion of that time, and you could say that his book was a reaction to some of the political things that were going on when Hoover was president. And I love this month because we're learning that there is not a hard delineation between politics, economics, philosophy, what have you. All of these things are intertwined, and a lot of times philosophy lies near the bottom of a lot of people's actionable economic decisions. For example, Hoover says economic depression cannot be cured by legislative action or executive pronouncement. I did some reading on Hoover, and apparently he was into this ideal of rugged individualism, and it affected his economic scheme. It was a philosophical idea that affected his economics. His belief was that you had to have a hands-off approach, and that businessmen and women had to be individuals. And that would be the true path to economic success long term, cultivating the individuals in the country. And this is a great idea of how he spiritually would define his individual. And this is interesting because I don't see anywhere Dewey defining a spiritual individual. He tries, but I don't see him doing it. Leadership cannot be created synthetically. Men must be what they were made by the Almighty, or the American people will find them out in time. Men must be what they were made to be. So that's interesting right there. There is no fluctuation of the individual. The individual does not adapt to culture. The individual is not a fluctuating creature. The individual is set in stone. And if they don't follow what they're set in stone, the American people will find them out. But what about Dewey? Did he agree with this? Well, read the book. That's all I will say to that. But I will say that something that came to mind is that... let's not do that. Okay, things that came to mind about Dewey. He seemed to assert that the individual must change and fluctuate with changing cultures, and the old ideals must be thrown out. Big thing for him was that the individual does not admit that we're living in a corporate world now. And because that's not admitted, the individual loses a sort of grounding that they might gain by admitting that the new world is corporate. So the rugged individualism of the frontier must pass away, according to Dewey. Loose ends, things that have not yet made sense to me. There's probably a lot more than this, but this might help you as you think through this on your own time. First, what is the definition of an individual, and is defining such even helpful? That's the thing. I don't remember any time where Wilde or Dewey or anybody else who I perused attempted to define what an individual is. The closest they ever got was by simply giving a new area for an individual to ground himself or herself. That's the closest I ever got to a definition. Second, what exactly would be an example of a new and improved individual? What would that look like? And is it even possible to conceive of such a person? That's a funny thing. How does anybody in these discussions have the right to say the old system did not create a good individual and this new system for grounding an individual will? Like, how can anybody say that? Is it possible to have a system where an individual is not grounded in anything? Or is that just the definition of insanity? But anyway, at the end of it all, why does any of this even matter? Is the big question I keep coming back to. If we can't define a true individual versus a non-individual or a less than individual, is this even an actionable train of thought down which to travel, or is this so much hand-waving? So those are some things to think about as we continue through this month's reading, and hopefully it's pertinent. And if you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to share them.